unfortunately, it is one of the defects of our political system that we always put a Secretary of the Treasury and other high government officials into a position in which, when they make public statements, they are almost driven. Well, what's the word I want to use? I want to use a polite word, equivocate. Secretary Blumenthal knows as well as you and I do that inflation does not come from trade unions. That doesn't mean that trade unions aren't grasping. Of course they are. But they don't produce inflation for one simple reason. They do not own a printing press on which you can turn out green pieces of paper. The only such printing press is in Washington. I say printing press, of course, in the modern age we do it in a more sophisticated way. We use bookkeepers and accountants and computers. But it comes down to the same thing. Inflation is made in Washington because only Washington can create money.
Wise words by Milton Friedman in the prelude. He's absolutely true, but I talk to people about this all the time. People complain about inflation, and lately they've been talking about inflation is caused by price gouging by the corporations. This just simply isn't true. They're not capable of doing that, as Milton Friedman had stated previously. Only the government can print money, and only the government can inflate money, and they inflate money by this process we're about to go through here. I think this is something that's completely misunderstood, and so today I'm going to address that with this beautiful video from the addendum of Zeitgeist called Modern Money Mechanics. So let's take a look and we'll talk about it after.
A number of years ago, the Central Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, produced a document entitled Modern Money Mechanics. This publication detailed the institutionalized practice of money creation as utilized by the Federal Reserve and the web of global commercial banks it supports. On the opening page, the document states its objective. The purpose of this booklet is to describe the basic process of money creation in a fractional reserve banking system. It then proceeds to describe this fractional reserve process through various banking terminology, a translation of which goes something like this. The United States government decides it needs some money, so it calls up the Federal Reserve and requests, say, $10 billion. The Fed replies, saying, sure, we'll buy $10 billion in government bonds from you. So the government takes some pieces of paper, paints some official-looking designs on them, and calls them treasury bonds. Then it puts a value on these bonds to the sum of $10 billion and sends them over to the Fed. In turn, the people at the Fed draw up a bunch of impressive pieces of paper themselves, only this time calling them Federal Reserve notes, also designating a value of $10 billion to the Fed. The Fed then takes these notes and trades them for the bonds. Once this exchange is complete, the government then takes the $10 billion in Federal Reserve notes and deposits it into a bank account. And upon this deposit, the paper notes officially become legal tender money, adding $10 billion to the U.S. money supply. And there it is. $10 billion in new money has been created. Of course, this example is a generalization, for, in reality, this transaction would occur electronically, with no paper used at all. In fact, only 3% of the U.S. money supply exists in physical currency. The other 97% essentially exists in computers alone. Now, government bonds are, by design, instruments of debt. And when the Fed purchases these bonds, with money it essentially created out of thin air, the government is actually promising to pay back that money to the Fed. In other words, the money was created out of debt. This mind-numbing paradox of how money or value can be created out of debt or a liability.
This is the part that I think most people don't understand. Money equals a debt. It doesn't seem intuitive, but when you realize that money is created out of debt by loans, and he's going to explain that right now, but fractional reserve banking is so misunderstood. Not many people realize this.
Will become more clear as we further this exercise. So the exchange has been made, and now $10 billion sits in a commercial bank account. Here's where it gets really interesting. For as based on the fractional reserve practice, that $10 billion deposit instantly becomes part of the bank's reserves, just as all deposits do. And regarding reserve requirements, as stated in modern money mechanics, a bank must maintain legally required reserves equal to a prescribed percentage of its deposits. It then quantifies this by stating, under current regulations, the reserve requirement against most transaction accounts is 10%.
Now, recently that number has dropped. It dropped to, I think, 3%, and now it is down to 0%. And they did this or the Federal Reserve decided this to ease the pressure on the banks because they had no reserve left to be sustainable. And that's exactly what happened with the Silicon Valley Bank. They couldn't afford their reserve requirements, so they basically went out of business. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's basically the gist of that. So this 10% is now, in most cases, 0%. Now it can change, but it's been drastically lowered as of late.
This means that with a $10 billion deposit, 10% or $1 billion is held as the required reserve, while the other $9 billion is considered an excessive reserve and can be used as the basis for new loans. Now, it is logical to assume that this $9 billion is literally coming out of the existing $10 billion deposit. However, this is actually not the case. What really happens is that the $9 billion is simply created out of thin air on top of the existing $10 billion deposit. This is how the money supply is expanded. As stated in modern money mechanics, of course they, the banks, do not really pay out loans from the money they receive as deposits. If they did this, no additional money would be created. What they do when they make loans is to accept promissory notes, loan contracts, in exchange for credits, money, to the borrower's transaction accounts. In other words, the $9 billion can be created out of nothing simply because there is a demand for such a loan and that there is a $10 billion deposit to satisfy the reserve requirements. Now, let's assume that somebody walks into this bank and borrows the newly available $9 billion. They will then most likely take that money and deposit it into their own bank account. The process then repeats, for that deposit becomes part of the bank's reserves. 10% is isolated, and in turn 90% of the $9 billion, or $8.1 billion, is now available as newly created money for more loans. And, of course, that 8.1 can be loaned out and redeposited, creating an additional 7.2 billion, to 6.5 billion, to 5.9 billion, etc. This deposit money creation loan cycle can technically go on to infinity. The average mathematical result is that about $90 billion can be created on top of the original $10 billion. In other words, for every deposit that ever occurs in the banking system, about 9 times that amount can be created out of thin air.
Money jitters. Ask the obliging Bank of America for a jar of soothing instant money, M-O-N-E-Y, in the form of a convenient personal loan.
So, now that we understand how money is created by this fractional reserve banking system, a logical yet elusive question might come to mind. What is actually giving this newly created money value? The answer? The money that already exists.
Now, this used to be based upon a gold standard, a gold and silver standard. So, in the past, this ended in 1973, I believe. In the past, money required a gold backing of this. Now there's no such requirement. There is no gold standard. There is nothing backing this. So the only thing that new money can take its value from is the old money. And this is what, by definition, what inflation is.
The new money essentially steals value from the existing money supply. For the total pool of money is being increased irrespective to demand for goods and services. And as supply and demand finds equilibrium, prices rise, diminishing the purchasing power of each individual dollar. This is generally referred to as inflation, and inflation is essentially a hidden tax on the public.
What is the advice that you generally get? And that is inflate the currency. They don't say debase the currency. They don't say devalue the currency. They don't say cheat the people who are saved. They say lower the interest rates. The real deception is when we distort the value of money, when we create money out of thin air. We have no savings, yet there's so-called capital. So my question boils down to this: how in the world can we expect to solve the problems of inflation, that is, the increase in the supply of money, with more inflation?
Of course, it can't. The fractional reserve system of monetary expansion is inherently inflationary. For the act of expanding the money supply without there being a proportional expansion of goods and services in the economy will always debase a currency.
And this is why we're having this issue now as far as in the U.S. It's basically like they printed a ton of money during COVID to give everybody a check. Now we're feeling the effects of those checks that they printed out for everybody in the country to stimulate. So they give them everybody, $2,000 or whatever, $1,700 depending on who you are. But that money came from nothing. So prices are going to go up. So that's exactly why we have this problem now, as far as with, eggs being $8 a carton, so this is the reason that people don't understand, and that hidden tax. This is the way that government operates at a deficit. So they just raise the debt ceiling. Every time you hear them on the news, when they're saying we're raising the debt ceiling, they're raising the amount of money that they could borrow, but they limit themselves. And then they say, oh, but that never sticks. So, the government's going to shut down if you don't raise the debt ceiling. So then they raise it again, and they just take more money, and they just complete this cycle over and over again. The problem is it's unsustainable, and it's a parabolic curve that you can't get out of. And we're feeling those effects right now.
In fact, a quick glance at the historical values of the US dollar versus the money supply reflects this point definitively, for the inverse relationship is obvious. $1 in 1913 required $21.60 in 2007 to match value. That is a 96% devaluation since the Federal Reserve came into existence. Now, if this reality of inherent and perpetual inflation seems absurd and economically self-defeating,
There's more.
hold that thought, for absurdity is an understatement in regard to how our financial system really operates. For in our financial system, money is debt, and debt is money. Here is a chart of the U.S. money supply from 1950 to 2006. Here is a chart of the U.S. national debt for the same period. How interesting it is that the trends are virtually the same. For the more money there is, the more debt there is. The more debt there is, the more money there is. To put it a different way, every single dollar in your wallet is owed to somebody by somebody. For remember, the only way the money can come into existence is from loans. Therefore, if everyone in the country were able to pay off all debts, including the government, there would not be $1 in circulation.
Think about that.
In fact, the last time in American history the national debt was completely paid off was in 1835 after President Andrew Jackson shut down the central bank that preceded the Federal Reserve. In fact, Jackson's entire political platform essentially revolved around his commitment to shut down the central bank, stating at one point, "The bold efforts the present bank has made to control the government are but premonitions of the fate that awaits the American people, should they be deluded into a perpetuation of this institution or the establishment of another like it." Unfortunately, his message was short-lived, and the international bankers succeeded to install another central bank in 1913, the Federal Reserve. And as long as this institution exists, perpetual debt is guaranteed. Now, so far we have discussed the reality that money is created out of debt, through loans. These loans are based on a bank's reserves, and reserves are derived from deposits. And through this fractional reserve system, any one deposit can create 9 times its original value, in turn debasing the existing money supply, raising prices in society. And since all this money is created out of debt and circulated randomly through commerce, people become detached from their original debt, and a disequilibrium exists where people are forced to compete for labor in order to pull enough money out of the money supply to cover their costs of living. As dysfunctional and backwards as all of this might seem, there is still one thing we have omitted from this equation.
One thing.
And it is this element of the structure which reveals the truly fraudulent nature of the system itself: the application of interest. When the government borrows money from the Fed, or when a person borrows money from a bank, it almost always has to be paid back with accrued interest. In other words, almost every single dollar that exists must be eventually returned to a bank with interest paid as well. But if all money is borrowed from the central bank and is expanded by commercial banks through loans, only what would be referred to as the principal is being created in the money supply. So then, where is the money to cover all of the interest that is charged? Nowhere. It doesn't exist. The ramifications of this are staggering, for the amount of money owed back to the banks will always exceed the amount of money that is available in circulation. This is why inflation is a constant in the economy, for new money is always needed to help cover the perpetual deficit built into the system, caused by the need to pay the interest. What this also means is that mathematically, defaults and bankruptcy are literally built into the system, and there will always be poor pockets of society that get the short end of the stick. An analogy would be a game of musical chairs, for once the music stops, somebody is left out to dry. And that's the point. It invariably transfers true wealth from the individual to the banks. For if you are unable to pay for your mortgage, they will take your property. This is particularly enraging when you realize that not only is such a default inevitable due to the fractional reserve practice, but also because of the fact that the money that the bank loaned to you didn't even legally exist in the first place.
And when he says legally exist, he means that there's nothing backing that value. So whenever if they're giving you pieces of paper or digits on a computer, they're not giving anything of value. It's called consideration. He's going to go into this a little bit, but the fact that they can do that legally is unbelievable. So you default on a payment, they take your physical property, so your house note or something like that. So I mean, the fact that they could steal things of real value like real estate, cars, whatever, because you were unable to pay this in a system that's rigged against you, is unbelievable. It's truly unbelievable when you truly think about these things. And how many times this happens a day, and we just kind of write it off as like, oh, it's just life. It's not, but it's not normal. It's why, excuse me, it's why BlackRock can go in and buy, all these properties at pennies on the dollar, because they're buying all these default properties or blighted properties that were just repoed by the bank. So that corporation, BlackRock, now owns, I want to say it's almost 40% of the single housing home market, and they're going to basically rent it back out to you. It's unbelievable.
In 1969, there was a Minnesota court case involving a man named Jerome Daly, who was challenging the foreclosure of his home by the bank which provided the loan to purchase it. His argument was that the mortgage contract required both parties, being he and the bank, each put up a legitimate form of property for the exchange. In legal language, this is called consideration.
They've removed the requirement for consideration from banks. This has changed since 2007 when this came out.
Mr. Daly explained that the money was, in fact, not the property of the bank, for it was created out of nothing as soon as the loan agreement was signed. Remember what modern money mechanics stated about loans? What they do when they make loans is to accept promissory notes in exchange for credits. Reserves are unchanged by the loan transactions, but deposit credits constitute new additions to the total deposits of the banking system. In other words, the money doesn't come out of their existing assets. The bank is simply inventing it, putting up nothing of its own, except for a theoretical liability on paper. As the court case progressed, the bank's president, Mr. Morgan, took the stand, and in the judge's personal memorandum, he recalled that The plaintiff, bank's president, admitted that, in combination with the Federal Reserve Bank, did create the money and credit upon its books by bookkeeping entry. The money and credit first came into existence when they created it. Mr. Morgan admitted that no United States law or statute existed which gave him the right to do this. A lawful consideration must exist and be tendered to support the note. The jury found that there was no lawful consideration, and I agree. He also poetically added, "Only God can create something of value out of nothing." And upon this revelation, the court rejected the bank's claim for foreclosure, and Daley kept his home. The implications of this court decision are immense. For every time you borrow money from a bank, whether it is a mortgage loan or a credit card charge, the money given to you is not only counterfeit, it is an illegitimate form of consideration, and hence voids the contract to repay, for the bank never had the money as property to begin with. Unfortunately, such legal realizations are suppressed and ignored, and the game of perpetual wealth transfer and perpetual debt continues. And this brings us to the ultimate question: why?
Why indeed, my friends? Why indeed? So it's crazy to think that this is a normal practice. Like this is something that people.
This brings us to the ultimate.
Sorry, people think that this is the way the natural world is supposed to work. It didn't before, and it doesn't have to. And the reality is that with the interest payments that don't exist, there's no way to pay it back. So the parabolic curve of inflation will continue. In other words, people, if they think the inflation is bad now, you can slow it, but you can't stop it. So things are going to get more expensive as time goes on. It's just inevitable. There is no way around that with the modern Federal Reserve banking system. The only way to get rid of this is to have Congress take back the money creation abilities. The only way to take this back, and I know some people disagree with me on this, is to set a gold standard. They're like, oh, that's just unrealistic today. But it's the only thing that makes sense. The digital currency, there's a lot of people out there that talk about Bitcoin. That, to me, is the same thing. It's fiat currency, and they're like, well, they can never create more than 21 million. It's capped at that. Says who? You can't trust that it's ever going to grow. They're just, but what they're going to do is they're going to try to make a digital currency, a national digital currency. They'll probably outlaw Bitcoin for use in the U.S. or something to force people to go to a national digital currency. I've heard people say, well, they can't outlaw it because, it's not controlled by any one government, and I get that. But the reality is they could say, we do not accept it in the United States. It's against the law to accept Bitcoin as a payment for services rendered. I mean, they could do that, and then what? I mean, so you can only deal with overseas stuff, or that, and that's fine, but that's going to reduce the value as well. So to me, the only true money that you could possibly have is something that's not fiat, which is something that's based upon gold or silver or property or some sort of tangible item. Gold and silver is just traditional. That's why it's useful metals. They have value. So if you did a combination of things, of property, gold, silver, oil, other things, maybe, that would be the best way to have consideration of true value and to keep a cap on the money growth. That's the secret to fight inflation. If the Congress took over money printing and took it away from the banks, they wouldn't owe interest to the banks that print the money for them, which is insane. So why would you, if I borrow $1 from you and now I owe you $1.10, and I can only get money from you, that 10 cents doesn't exist. And I can't ever pay that back. Let me borrow another 10 cents. Okay, now you owe me 12 more cents. So if people don't understand that, I don't know what else to tell them. But this is woefully understood. Like people do not care about this. They don't want to ever talking about this or dealing with this, but this is the exact reason you are feeling these things at the store. This is the reason gas has gone up. This is the reason milk, eggs, everything you buy in the store has gone up. But nobody wants to do anything about it, and no president or politician typically wants to deal with this because they know it's going to be a painful changeover. People like Peter Schiff talk about this stuff all the time, and everybody labels him just, oh, you're just a doomsayer, you're just this, you're that. But this is the reality, and it's time to kind of wake up to these realities. We'll leave it at this for this week. But yeah, flying solo this week. My boy Zane is going on a little vacation, so I'll just have him covered today. Hopefully he'll watch this and like this video. Hopefully you like it, subscribe it, share it. Let's get the word around about this, man. This is a problem that we need to kind of become the adults in the room and address. I think it's high time because what we're doing now is just 100% unsustainable. Thanks for joining, guys.